now turn this over to Ben Wilder. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Murray. Good morning, everyone. It's awesome to see the response from you all, and I'm just kind of picturing us underneath one of the tents out on the University of Arizona kind of mall on the lawn there back in March, and channeling all that good energy from the Tucson Festival of Books that I know we all miss so much. So I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of recapture some of that energy and those good vibes, and to be with you all this morning. So John and Eric, it's a pleasure to be with you on this panel and to talk about your work. Ever more timely, no? It's kind of, I was reading just this morning actually in the Arizona Daily Star, an article by Tony Davis that was talking about projected, low and for the kind of the drought, the very dry April, and forecasting what that's going to mean. And lo and behold, who did they quote? Well, it was you guys. So it's great to hear from the experts this morning. I'm going to just to kind of put us all on the same page again. I'm just going to read from the description of this panel, just kind of get us in the mind space, and then we'll kind of get going here. So, for most Americans, water is everywhere, right? We drink by turning on our tap, enjoy swimming in pools, especially this time of year, or lakes, go to the grocery store, find it in bottled and flavored in every imaginable way, right? But what is actually the state of water in the West? Well, this morning we're going to take a deep dive and examine our liquid assets from water experts who are monitoring our resources, and that we really depend on this water for our living. So, former General Manager of the Colorado River Water Conservation District, Eric Kuhn, and Director of the University of New Mexico's Water Resources Program, John Fleck, are going to discuss the overallocation of the Colorado River and explain how today's water managers are trying to reverse the mistakes of the past. And we're going to get into that. So at this point, I just want to I'll just turn it over to Eric and John. You're going to give a little information, give us an overview. And then at that point, swing it back to me, and I'll just kind of pose some questions for us to kind of get the conversation going. And then we're going to reserve time towards the latter quarter of the hour to get into question and answers via all of you on the Zoom chat box. You can submit your questions that way. It's going to be really good. So again, thank you all for being here, and Eric and John, go for it.
Thank you all for coming. It's really delightful. I wish we could have been doing this on the University of Arizona campus in Tucson, although by doing it this way, some other folks who weren't in Tucson get to join us, so it's a mixed bag. The title of our book, Science Be Damned, meant a lot to us when we wrote the book over the last number of years, as we're now in a remarkable global situation where we have to think rapidly and flexibly about how to incorporate science in our decision making. It somehow seems especially relevant. So Eric and I would like to kind of talk about our little case study, which in some sense pales in comparison to what we're thinking about globally, but maybe it'll shed a little bit of light on how we think about making decisions under uncertainty and trying to incorporate the best science in how we go about doing that. Let's see if I can get the slides to move. So yeah, so Eric, why don't you kind of give folks an overview of the Colorado River Basin and the context in which we're talking about water.
Yeah, well, thank you, John. I've worked in the Colorado River Basin now for almost 40 years, and it's really become a passion. Before that, I was in the Navy, and I actually I was born in Canada, but grew up a big part of my life in Flagstaff, Arizona. So I know the basin well. And the Colorado River is considered one of our great rivers in the North America. It drains about 1/12 of the continental 48 states. It serves water users in 7 United States states and 2 states in Mexico, so 2 countries as well. But when you look at the area that it drains and you look at the flow is really quite modest, if not meager. The natural flow of the river, and by natural flow, what we mean is what would be there if it wasn't impacted by man. The natural flow of the river would put it somewhere between the Illinois River and the Hudson River in terms of flow. Maybe 1/12 of the Columbia River Basin, which also has a similar drainage area, about 250,000 square miles. So what I realized a number of years ago, really beginning in about 2000, was there was lots of talk about the river being over allocated, but it was going to happen, and it has happened. This river, which has about 15 million acre feet a year in its natural flow status, not a drop of it gets to the Gulf of Baja California down there, as you can see below Yuma. We had a little pulse flow a few years ago that was a man-made event where we released stored water and a tiny bit of it made it to the Gulf. But as a practical matter, every drop of water is used. And when we use this water, it's not only in the basin, but it's in areas outside the basin, the Southern California coastal plain from Los Angeles to San Diego, the Wasatch Front, Salt Lake City to Provo, the Cheyenne uses Colorado River water, the entire Colorado Front Range, where 85% of the population of Colorado live, and the Albuquerque, New Mexico, Central Arizona or Central New Mexico corridor use this water. So it's a regional resource. Exports out of the basin are a major issue and a major concern. We transport water all over the place, including pumping it from the Parker area into Phoenix and all the way to Tucson. So we pump it uphill. But the bottom line is every drop is now used, and the allocation system, as we'll talk about, allocated legally about 17.5 million acre feet, 8.5 for what we call a lower basin, 7.5 for the upper basin, 1.5 million for Mexico. That's the paper rights, the paper allocation. But there's only about 13 or 14 million acre feet of water in this river today, for the last 20 years anyway, and all the climate science, and including studies that have just recently been released, suggest a much drier future. So what I'd like to say is the purpose of this book was to get us thinking about how we're going to stuff a 12 million acre feet river into a 17.5 million acre feet of legal entitlements and expectations. And that was my motivation for seeking out John's help and writing a book about the past, but the past really is there because we want us to think about how we're going to deal with this water resource in the future.
So this is the striking picture that sort of shows what's happened as a result of the overallocation. And we'll go back a little bit and talk about how the overallocation happened, but the picture on the left is what Lake Mead looks like full. Lake Mead is the major reservoir that serves Las Vegas and Los Angeles and the Imperial Valley and Phoenix and Tucson. Last full in the late 1990s, right around 2000. And the picture on the right, taken from essentially the same place, actually taken back in March, my last pre-pandemic trip to Lake Mead. You can see that big white line, we call that the bathtub ring, because the overallocation combined with climate change means there's less water flowing into the system, but we have continued to take a lot of water out of the system to serve the cities and the farms. And that's where we've ended up. I want to take a second to talk about how Eric and I came to collaborate to write this book, because there's a set of questions that we're dealing with in the book that Eric and I independently, we didn't know each other terribly well, over a number of years, where Eric and I were both thinking about these questions. So that thing you see at the top there is an old whiteboard that used to sit in my office here in my house in Albuquerque. And I was trying to understand how we made the mistake of over-allocating the river. And so as I was reading, this is when I was doing research for my last book, Waters for Fighting Over, every time I would come across a number, someone's estimate of how much water there was in the Colorado River, I would write it down on this whiteboard. And over a number of years, I sort of accumulated estimates, varying estimates, changing estimates. Eric, at the same time, was working on a couple of white papers that you see here on the right that he wrote for the River District, looking at a lot of the same questions. Eric, you know, a substantially more, I will say, sophisticated technical understanding of the river than I used to have an editor. I used to be a newspaperman. An editor would say, danger, danger, journalist doing math. Eric's mathematical sophistication was better than mine. And so we ended up teaming up, what now, 3 years ago, Eric? 4 years ago? It's been a while.
4 years ago, yeah.
4 years ago, collaborating. Eric lives up in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. I'm down here in Albuquerque. We would meet at Colorado River conferences or just drive in two directions and meet in Midway, or Eric would come down here in Albuquerque, and over a period of really 3 years, we wrote this book. We would always try to bring bicycles. We both like to ride bikes, so this is a picture I took when Eric and I were riding along the trail along Colorado River up in Grand Junction, I think, Eric. This is when we were riding in Grand Junction. Yeah. And trying to piece together the history of how we made this mistake. And it's a history that involves the use and the misuse, the poor use of science. And it's hard to characterize exactly the intentions of the people who made these mistakes, but over time, we had some scientists, and we have an example of one of them here, named Eugene Clyde Larue, who were saying from the beginning, look, y'all, there's probably not as much water as you think. And then you had government scientists and government officials saying, oh, there's plenty of water. And maybe Eric can talk a little bit about the relationship between Larue and Davis, because that's at the heart of the story. Is we have Larue trying to warn the folks who were developing Hoover Dam that there was not enough water, and Arthur Powell Davis saying, go ahead and build the dam. Eric?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. The idea that many of the water users, many of the water managers that I worked with had the view that there was sort of an accident that we ended up in the situation, because the first 20 years of the Colorado River that were gauged from about 1900 to 1920 happened to be very wet. Perhaps we call it now the early 20th century pluvial, which is maybe the wettest 25-year period that we know of in the Colorado River, and we've reconstructed flows back to about 800. That it was completely an accident. And what I started seeing when I started reading many of these is it really wasn't an accident. There was, in many ways, we almost had the same understanding of the Colorado River, except for climate change in 1920s, as we have today in terms of this guy, Larue. He nailed the long-term average flow of the river within about 500,000 acre-feet a year. But his message was, as we say in the book, inconvenient to the politics of how the agencies, especially Reclamation, and the states wanted to divide up the river. And that's sort of the core message. And the second message there is, once it started, it took a long time to stop, and it may not even be stopped today. We take this, in this book, we talk about the same mistakes that were made in 1922 were repeated in 2012 with the Basin study. So with that, maybe Ben can go and start asking us the questions now that we've given a teaser and an overview, and we can get specific. All right, Ben?
Sounds good. Well, yeah, I mean, let's go. So we'll start fairly general here. So you can each kind of touch on this. What do you? I mean, you can either say kind of a sentence or use even a first word and then elaborate. Like, what do each of you think of first, kind of from the different angles you're coming at this when it comes to water in the West?
So I have I've grown up in the West. I grew up in Southern California and lived in Southern California before I moved here to Albuquerque. In both cases, the two places I've lived for pretty much my whole life, places that depend on the Colorado River and that are also arid. And there's this phenomenon in these arid geographies of a dry landscape with a sort of ribbon of green, to quote the language of John Van Dyke, a ribbon of green in the middle of these valleys. And so there's always this moment where you're, coming into one of these Western cities and it's dry, and then there's always water in the center, and our cities are always built around their water. And so for me, water has always been the sort of central anchor for human communities. It's where we start. We always build around the water, the places we could cross a river and the places we can get water from the river to meet our needs. So I have always seen water as sort of central to the human experience and the nature and the structure of these communities that we live in. I mean, I've always loved that.
Yeah, and I would add, one of the things I saw when I was at the district, and I continue to see, is how ingrained expectations have become with respect to water development. In many ways, water development became a divine right, if you want to call it, and especially in the Upper Basin. If the Upper Basin people, managers in the 40s, 30s, 40s, and politicians, 40s, 50s, 60s, really up through the 70s, maybe it's changed now, had the view that, they had an entitlement to 7.5 million acre feet, whether the water was there or not. And that whether, if they could not use that water through economically viable projects, then the rest of the nation had a burden, if you want to call it, to subsidize their use. That was the Colorado River Storage Project Act, which developed a number of classic irrigation projects in the Upper Basin, and the subsidy there is 90% plus. So this expectation of water development, and it was related to, I think, an attitude that developed in the teens, 20s, and 30s, that if you were going to grow and prosper as a region, you needed to use more water. When I started in the early 80s, we talk about this in the book, the Denver Water Board had these huge conditional water rights for big projects that would take water out of the headwaters and move a lot of water to the Front Range. They already move a lot of water from projects they built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but they wanted to move even more water. And their attitude was, we were going to serve the Front Range, and the Front Range is growing, and our water use in the Front Range, because we all love, the bigger the lot, the better the subdivision. So water use was growing at an exponential rate. The two components were growth in the Front Range and personal growth, in terms of you were going to use more water. Each household wasn't going to use less; it was going to use a lot more. And you take that to it. You take the math, the exponential. We're talking about exponential growth right now, which people don't seem to understand in the pandemic. But in that water business, if you were one of the environmentalists looked at this and said, yeah, you take this out 100 years, and the Front Range was going to use all the water in the United States, and and in 1,000 years, all the water in the universe. This expectation was driving our needs, but what was happening on the ground was fundamentally different. What Denver was using Denver today uses the same amount of water they were using when I started work about 1981, and they serve almost twice as many people. So reality of what was happening on the ground with water use and these ingrained political expectations were at complete odds there, and there was no bridging the gulf between them. So I thought we really need to have this conversation if we're going to really have have a legitimate discussion about our future. And I point that out. The Upper Basin has this idea that it was entitled to 7.5 million acre feet, whether the water's there or not. So at some point, a scheme to provide legal certainty for water use and a political compromises that could develop the river became an entitlement. We really have to have that understanding if we're going to have a future, and I believe we're going to have a bright future on the river with less water, but we've got to get over some of these ingrained expectations.
So I think you mentioned that sense of entitlement kind of came on in the teens even. You said, can you maybe just address a little bit, like, how do you think that got ingrained, that sense of entitlement or expectation? Was it based on that the sense was that there's enough water to have that? Was it messaging? Was it a power grab? All of the above?
I think it was all of the above. I think that when you looked at you take the clock back to before the Colorado River Compact, there was a huge political movement, if you want to call it, cultural movement to settle the West. Manifest destiny, settle the West, and if your lands, and one of the ways to do it was to provide small farms so that people could come in and settle and have stable communities. And to have stable farms, you needed to have stable water supplies. The Reclamation Act of 1902, ironically, was created in part because of the drought of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, which was it was a very significant drought, which was replaced by the pluvial of the early 1900s. But so you had this economic development of let's provide this stable water supply so we can settle the West. The land is available. The land is free. The water, if it's not available, the government will help you build it. This ultimately became there with highways and telephones and electricity. So we provided the resources to provide this economic underpinning, an agrarian underpinning for communities. And then, this attitude was still there in the late 70s and 80s, even though, the Western Colorado was undergoing a boom for quality of life. You didn't move to Aspen or Summit County or Glenwood Springs or even Grand Junction to farm. You moved there because of the quality of life. So the allocation issue was also ingrained in the legal system, where prior appropriation, first in time is first in right, and that by establishing a right to use water, by using this water, you have a legal right to use it, and those that are first in line have the most senior rights, and that's prevailed, and that's not going to change. That is so fundamental to all of the states that's there. So it's a combination of legal development and the push for economic development of the Southwest, but not just the Southwest. You had reclamation projects in the state of Washington and Nevada, and Oregon, throughout the West.
John, you're going to.
So you had this political desire for the settling, the development of the West, and in order to do that, you needed a bunch of money from the federal government, and you also needed a bunch of water. And this is where the interplay between science and I think Eric and I argue in the book, science done poorly or not at all, then played this enabling role. So you had scientists like Larue saying, yeah, but there is not enough water for all this development that you would like to do. But you had the strong political desire to do the development. And so there was a tremendous incentive for the folks in favor of development to kind of pick and choose. So they had a way of cooking the science books to make it look like, in fact, there was going to be a long-term surplus in the Colorado River in order to enable all this development that they were proposing. So they wrote the Colorado River Compact not only to provide all this water, which on its face is more water than the river actually can provide. We now know, right? You saw the pictures of the emptying Lake Mead, but the compact actually had a provision that they would come back in 50 years because they believed, based on this faulty science that they were using, that there would actually be a bunch of surplus water not yet allocated. So once we built all these projects for all these cities and all these farms, there would be some extra water, and you would come back in the 1960s and allocate the rest. And one of the interesting things is Eric and I were working on the research is we could find, the compact says this, we'll come back in 50 years. We could find no evidence whatsoever of any discussion in the 1960s. By that time, they realized that they didn't have this surplus anymore. And so what they did then was say, well, okay, well, the phrase they used was, the word they used was augment. We'll go find some more water, a pipeline from the Columbia or a canal from the Columbia River, or towing icebergs or something. So that always as the river lagged behind the political ambitions for water use, people found a way to cook the science books and wave their arms and say, yeah, but we'll find some more water somewhere, and that's what's finally coming home to roost right now.
Well, kind of segueing on that, maybe train of thought is one thing that I sure see, with the pandemic right now is showing, just how vulnerable we are to disruptions, to major disruptions. And clearly, those of us that live in the West know that water and impending droughts are a very likely major disruption coming down. And perhaps, as I mentioned in that article today, this emerging mega drought idea, the idea of a multi-decades long, much below average rainfall period, and just the impact of that. So thinking about the term resilience and how to be able to, withstand that, and kind of thinking in the sense that these dams in many ways perhaps were established on that same train of thought of resilience, but now we're in the situation we are, that you describe it in the book, where the science has been damned, right? And it's not really addressed. The question here is, where do you see the best path forward in resilience across the West, both at small local scales or larger scales, that will better buffer all in the map that you showed, all those sectors of the West that depend on this overallocated river and the water from the sky or whatnot? Where do you see the best paths forwards for resilience?
So one of the things that Eric and I are working on, and a lot of other people work on a lot right now, is thinking about how we evolve the governance structures in order to create the flexibility to share a shrinking supply of water. And one of the real challenges is that you find a lot of people who can look at these legal structures in the law of the river and say, well, my understanding of the legal structure is that my entitlement is really pretty secure, and it's those other people, the folks in the lower basin, who really are overusing and need to take a cut, and we in the upper basin are not overusing. And in fact, that, I think Eric and I would argue that's the case. And the folks at the lower basin have some lawyers, and they're going to have a legal argument for why, yeah, but the upper basin still has an obligation to deliver some water under the rules. And so there are people who would like to have us be locked into this argument over the interpretation of the rules. And the alternative that I think I see emerging now, and this is a lot of what I wrote about in the last book, is this attempt to negotiate collaborative compromises around all these rules, so that everybody understands how their share of a shrinking river is going to be shrinking, and how we can share and collaborate. And that's the tension right now, although I think the collaboration side of the argument is winning. But all of that, back to the theme of our book, all of that has to be based on a clear-eyed understanding of the science, a clear-eyed understanding of how our runoff is changing under climate change and the risk of mega drought, as discussed in that new paper that Ben mentioned. It's sort of like, how do we incorporate the science? Well, and one of the really important pieces of the science, and this is the key point in the conclusion of our book, is that we need to recognize what Eric talked about earlier, that these notions of ever-growing water demand associated with ever-growing populations have just turned out not to be the case. So we need to recognize that we actually have gotten pretty good at using a lot less water, and that provides us the opportunities to use less water over time as the supply shrinks.
Yeah, that's what I would point out, is that we've got we are adapting to this. That's why the legal structure and what's happening on the ground are two differences. For example, since every drop of the water is now used between the United States and Mexico, Upper Basin and Lower Basin, we're still going to have new projects. We're still going to have urbanization of Grand Junction and the Montrose area. And what's going to happen, what's been happening, and we've seen, is that they're moving, the subdivisions are replacing irrigated hayfields. And the reality that we recognized many years ago in the Upper Basin is subdivisions use less water than irrigation does, because you have rooftops and driveways and open spaces. As urbanization is occurring in western Colorado, we're actually using less water. And there are still these expectations for new projects, and I think new projects will proceed, but it simply means if a project is being proposed and is developed in the Upper Basin, ultimately someone else in the basin as a whole, the Upper Basin would say, because they're underusing their allocation, it has to come from the Lower Basin, someone's going to use less. So we're in a zero-sum, negative-sum game because of climate change. And as new development comes on, someone else uses less. And the system, the system is sort of slowly adapting to that with the drought contingency plans. As the Lake Mead drops, the amount of water that Nevada, Arizona, and California take from the main stem is going to go down. Because of the priority system, it puts perhaps some people think undue burden on the Central Arizona project, because they were going back to first in time as first in right, they were the last in line. So, and the same is true in the Upper Basin. As development continues to occur, we're going to see a change of use, overall probably less. But one thing we need to do is recognize how do we govern this situation. We characterized the 1922 compact, when the river was a little bit developed but not much, as a political agreement between the Upper Basin states that were growing very slowly, and the Lower Basin states that could grow much faster, as a compromise, a political agreement that allowed them to go hat in hand to Congress and say, let's develop the river. That's why we had the Boulder Canyon Project Act, Colorado River Storage Project Act. It was an agreement of convenience between the two. Now we're looking at the same thing, but perhaps a little more difficult, between the agricultural users, who were first in time, and the municipal users, who were the last projects to be built. That happened in California. It happened in Arizona. It's happening in Colorado, where this agreement is going to have to be between the cities that need certainty of water supply, perhaps not total new water in total, but they need certainty of supply, and the agricultural users in the Yuma area, Palo Verde, that require, or that are going to provide this water by economics. When I started work in the Colorado River District, the biggest Trans Mountain Diversion, the Colorado Big Thompson project, was primarily an agricultural project. Today, it's a token irrigation project and primarily a municipal project. The same thing happened in the Salt River project. At one time, it was 100% of its water use was for agriculture, close to 100%. Today, it's a token use. In the Phoenix area, as growth has overcome these agricultural lands. but that gives us the flexibility to use less water. I think John has said, and I totally agree, that we ultimately figure out how to use the water nature provides. We'll get there.
Well, in thinking about the ways that that we can improve, or that both like as members of the public, but also kind of decision makers across the board. So what areas do you see that we need to improve, either in science, communication, or other, in order to better inform decision makers to address the challenges that you each described?
John, yeah.
Yeah, so this is an incredibly difficult issue where, and this is something that, you know, I had a career as a journalist before I became an academic, working on communicating effectively about the science was the solution to the problem. And I realize, and we see it today in the pandemic, that, you know, people's wishful thinking about what they want the science to be telling them is difficult to overcome. But I think that makes it incumbent on the institutions, on political leaders and the government agencies that are doing the research, and the academic research community, to be that much more attentive to the risks of engaging in that sort of wishful thinking. And I have this belief, which I kind of feel frustrated right now watching the pandemic, in the naivety of my belief, but I think we're experiencing something pretty remarkable right now as we watch society's response to the pandemic, where science, still contested, still politically riven by conflict, is playing a really significant and important public role. I'm so struck by, I spent some time talking to my students about this, the prevalence of the flatten the curve graph and theme. There's never been a piece of science that I think has been so impactful in such a rapid way on society, and it shows that we're at least willing to consider inconvenient science when it affects us in important ways. And I think that's the obligation of the leadership, the folks who are making these decisions, to really take seriously the science. And I think what I have seen, as you know, Eric's been a participant, I've just been a spectator in water management, but I have seen in the water management community over the last 15 or 20 years that I've been really active in this field, an increasing willingness to take the science of climate change seriously, to really incorporate it and to seek out the best climate change science, the best hydrologic science to help inform decisions. And that makes me really optimistic about our ability to do this. The pessimism I have goes back to the point I made earlier about the demand side. We still have water managers who have this almost instinctive desire to presume continued growth means continued water use for their communities. And that's a piece of science that I think we haven't more effectively enough incorporated. You can sort of see this in the discussions over the Lake Powell pipeline in Utah right now, where there's just this expectation that the growth of the St. George area demands more water. And, you know, we need to kind of recognize the science in situations like that as well.
Yeah, and you know, I've agree with John, but one thing we have here that is not clear to me in the pandemic is we've got both science and a legal infrastructure on the river, and the legal infrastructure on the river has created these expectations. It's created a way of allocating this resource for priority system. First in time is first in right. That's not going to change, or very difficult to change. And, you know, for example, we have climate change. And climate change is uniquely putting in our view, at least from an Upper Basin perspective, a risk on the Upper Basin. The Upper Basin has an obligation under the compact to deliver us, or not deliver, but to not deplete a certain amount of water at Lee Ferry there in northern Arizona, plus to provide, and it's a disputed issue, a portion of the water to Mexico. That creates a level of understanding there. When they were negotiating the compact, Utah's commissioner suggested that there be a 10,000 CFS in effect water right at Lee Ferry. Well, 10,000 CFS is about 77.3 million acre feet per year. The non-depletion obligation was 75 over 10. So you can see they were in the same ballpark, but he was thinking in terms of water rights. So he wanted to say, well, let's just have a 10,000 CFS right. I'm glad they didn't go that way. But as the yield of the river goes down, even if precipitation goes up, that's what's scary. As precipitation goes up, temperatures go up. We have now had science after science suggest that the temperature factor overwhelms even increasing precipitation in some cases, like in the northern part of the basin in Wyoming and northern Colorado. So the Upper Basin is being squeezed. And I think for a long-term settlement of the issues, the Upper Basin and the Lower Basin need to figure out how to collectively take the risk of climate change and to share that risk. And that's one of the challenges that I saw in the book. And I'm telling you that I do have an Upper Basin perspective. I've lived for 40 years in Glenwood Springs. I grew up, I went to high school in Flagstaff. So this is one of those challenges, but it has a legal and a science and a management perspective to it. And all three of them have to be integrated. Today, they're sort of operated under separate worlds.
Great. We're gonna switch here for the rest of the time period to getting some of your questions all answered here. So you guys are already getting at it. So again, remember to put your questions in the Zoom chat box here, and we'll get to as many as we can. I guess to start, we're just kind of referencing the compact and your answers there. So there's a question that says, could you put into context the politics of the compact signing? Were there national politics, and in what way are other interests driving the formation of the compact, and I would say how?
Eric?
Yeah, I think the politics were also driven by this issue of equity. The Boulder Canyon Project Act was such a huge success. We really can't overstate the impact that the construction of Hoover Dam had on the Southwest, the American psyche as a whole. Michael Hiltzik talks about this being as one of the crowning achievements of the American century, and the fact that it did everything that the promoters of the project suggested it would. It provided power, it provided water, it controlled the river. After World War II, reclamation was on basically a significant high. Support for federal development of water along the lines of the Boulder Canyon Project Act and the other projects like the Grand Coulee Dam, equally important in the Northwest Bureau of Reclamation project. So it was seen as a real success story, and the Upper Basin wanted to pattern its success after the Lower Basin. The Lower Basin got its project. Actually, California got its project. Arizona viewed Hoover Dam as a California project. So California got its share. Now we needed ours. And that mentality led to the Colorado River Storage Project Act, which created water supplies for the Upper Basin and subsidized those supplies. The same thing for the Central Arizona Project. The politics of equity created that. And it put the Upper Basin in a heck of a corner when we understood, and our hydrologists understood, that the Central Arizona project was going to rely on Upper Basin unused water to develop. And now we're in that situation, and we got to figure out a way to get out of it.
It's really important to remember the context of the Colorado River Compact in 1922 and then the Boulder Canyon Project Act in 1928 and 29, in the context of sort of the evolution of the notion of the United States as a nation. You know, for a lot of the history of the nation, we were our federalism suggested a group of individual states kind of loosely bound together. And, you know, obviously there were points in that history, and the Civil War is the greatest example, where, you know, big discussions about what it meant to act collectively and together as a nation happened. But Hoover Dam, the construction of Hoover Dam and the legal structures that went before it, and then the infrastructure and legal structures that went after it, is one of the sort of great turning points in our national history, where we really considered, especially here in the West, federal government action, national government action in service of sort of large-scale national interests. It was this great coming together, and I think that's an important piece of the context, going back to Eric's and my point in the book about the misuse of the science. Is there was this tremendous motivation on the part of the people who were trying to do this stuff to really find a way to come together as all these Western states and act collectively using the national purse and the national interest. And that was just a tremendous driver. I mean, I think one of the arguments Eric and I make in the book is that, you know, there was an inevitability about this happening, and they were, you know, the cooking of the science is a sad affair in terms of its implications for us today, but there was just this inevitability as we tried to come together as a nation and act at that scale.
Yeah, and I would add to what John says that, you know, I've looked at this and I've come to the conclusion, you know, when you look at what Herbert Hoover, as the chairman of the Compact Commission, and he was the Secretary of Commerce at the time, he really had envisioned a very narrow federal role. And he talks about that in his writings. He testified by Congress that had by the time he became president, that had fundamentally changed. And by the time he lost, you know, his second term, that had completely changed. It had gone from a limited federal role to one of, you know, the federal government is the only one that can build these big projects, tame the river, provide certainty for water, provide power for people. And that happened right there, you know, basically in that 10 years from 1922 to about 1931. It's very significant. You know, and we look at that, and the science helped adjust that. If it wasn't for a hydrologist named Debler, who, I don't want to say cooked the books, but he took he took the glasses half full perspective of the water supply. And if it wasn't for that report that he did in the late 1920s, the secretary could have easily concluded there was not enough water to provide the Metropolitan Water District with a 1.2 million acre feet to pump to the coast. And if they didn't get that 1.2 million acre feet of water, they weren't going to pay for the power from Hoover Dam. Essentially, the Metropolitan Water District in Southern California underwrote the financing of Hoover Dam, and it turned, you know, and made the project a success. So I just find that, you know, I think about the federal role today, and we're still struggling with that federal role in terms of where we are now with water. The Bureau of Reclamation really has been assisting with some Indian projects, but really by the early 1980s, its classic role of reclaiming lands so we could have 160 acre farms throughout the West and provide this stable environment and economic environment, that was all gone. Nixon called that a myth in the early 1970s.
On that note about kind of the federal role, there's a couple of questions here regarding the Lake Powell pipeline. And so I guess first, if so one, if you could just kind of just describe briefly what the status of the Lake Powell pipeline is, just to bring us all up to speed. But then two, the specific questions are, in 2026, the drought contingency plan is going to be reworked. How do you see that affecting this proposed Lake Powell pipeline that Utah's been working on since 2006? And then is there going to, a couple of thoughts, is there going to be water for it? And where do you see that all going?
Yeah, let me just describe the Lake Powell pipeline. It's a very, well, it's not a unique project. This is the second project of this nature. It's diverting water at Lake Powell in the upper basin. Utah is a state of the upper division with interests in both the lower basin and the upper basin. A portion of the Colorado River Basin that is drained by the Virgin River is a lower basin tributary. Something that was well understood, by Utah's compact negotiator. Well, St. George is growing, and their Virgin River supply, the planners down there don't think it's sufficient to meet the future needs of the St. George area. So Utah believes it has unused entitlement to water under the Colorado River, something we could argue about forever. But they're the ones in charge, and they believe that. So they want to use a little bit of water, about 80,000 acre-feet of water, and pump it from Lake Powell into the lower basin where St. George is located. This raises both legal and policy issues. When I say it's the second project, the Navajo Gallup pipeline actually has a spur that goes into Window Rock that hasn't been built yet. A small amount of water in the neighborhood of 4,000 to 6,000 acre-feet was contemplated moving into the Navajo reservation that's in the lower basin. The states figured out how to get that done, and my assumption is the states may or may not figure out how to get this Lake Powell pipeline done, but clearly there are some legal issues here. From a water supply perspective, it's Utah's risk. I see it as a way that if the water's not there and Lake Powell pipeline is built, then Utah is going to do the same thing Colorado has been doing for 40 years, which is they're going to go to agricultural users and they're going to make the water supply for the pipeline existing irrigation. That's what's happening in Colorado. It's happened in Arizona. It happened in California. And if they're willing to accept that, I believe that that's their decision.
Right. Next question here is talking about the drought contingency plan, but in 2019 says that the upper reservoirs will support the level of Lake Powell. How do you see this playing out with climate change? Will those reservoirs be able to do that, in your opinion?
And I think that's the question that all the states in the science is going to have to grapple with. Like I said, the upper basin, Lake Powell has been operated to deliver 7.5 plus 8 and 750,000 less the little amount from the Prairie River. So it's been operated to deliver what we call 8.23 million acre feet. This was referred to as the minimum objective release. The lower basin sees this as the upper basin's legal obligation under the compact. The upper basin doesn't completely agree with that. They disagree with the provision that the Mexican treaty provision. And that's never been litigated. It's always been finessed. That what happens in the last 20 years, we've had about 12.5 million acre feet of water naturally in the upper basin. We're delivering a little 8.25. We're actually, because of the way the 2007 interim guidelines were designed, we're delivering a little bit more, like 8.8. That's something the upper basin bought into. Maybe they shouldn't have, but they bought into it. And what we see is that The upper basin is sort of, 4 million, 4.5 million is what we're using, and the surplus above where, our minimum delivery requirements is, they're about balancing each other out. Lake Powell dropped to its low in 2005. Since then, it's been hanging in there. It's been steady. So for the last 15 years, it's gone up in 1 year, down in another, and it's slightly above where it was in 2005. The lower basin has a problem, and they're using more water out of Lake Mead than they can sustain if the upper basin delivers that minimum amount. And I don't want to go into a long, detailed argument or discussion, but that's the big question that the states are going to have to grapple with when they renegotiate these 2007 interim guidelines. Is what happens with the upper basin's depletions, and how does the lower basin reduce its uses in a way that's acceptable politically to them?
And furthermore, how do we have a sort of collaborative effort to do that rather than having people retreat to their lawyered up corners and try to litigate this, which would just be a disaster? How do we find some middle ground of compromise between some deeply held views in both basins about an understanding of the law and the legal rights and entitlements?
This next question kind of takes us thinking more internationally and looking at the whole stretch of the river down to its delta in the Gulf. And I'm going to add one piece to Alberto's question too, but Alberto asked, what about the externalities of carbon storage and other ecosystem services in the former extensive delta forest related to the Gulf of California and that incredibly productive system? And that clearly transcends international boundaries. How is this factoring in the international component? And I guess I'll add on to Alberto's question that you referenced the pulse flow earlier, and essentially, what is the future bilateral binational relationship and collaboration and minute agreements, and where do you see all this all going in terms of working to recognize the externalities of carbon storage and also providing water to the river down and where it reaches its terminus in Sonora and at the head of the Gulf of California?
So this is one of the hardest problems on the river, because we used to have this just magnificent ecosystem down there, this vast wetland estuary between the U.S.-Mexico border and the sea. And when we took all the water out, that has gone away. We have moved an ecosystem to a different place. We're still putting that water on the land, and plants are growing with it. It's our farms. Millions of acres of farms have replaced millions of acres of wetland. And that will never come back, because we have made that choice as a society, both nations, to use this water in other ways. In small ways, it is being brought back at a fraction of the scale through really intentional environmental restoration projects and the allocation of water, small amounts of water, to habitat restoration. And this has grown out of what I think is the best and most important example of the kind of collaborative relationships that I've talked about, where there used to be significant conflict between the government and the people of the United States and the government and people of Mexico over the management of this river. Over the last 15 years, and in the last 10 years especially, there's been really a blossoming of collaboration, which interestingly has endured the change in administration here in the United States most recently to a government at its highest levels. It was very hostile toward Mexico, but the sort of in the trenches diplomacy among United States and Mexican participants has really been one of the high points. But in terms of that big ecosystem service that we used to see by the Delta, that's gone and will never come back.
I would maybe just add to that in the sense of being able to know some of the folks that are, as you call it there, John, the in the trenches diplomacy. And so much of that is just relationship building, and building is really form strong partnerships that are, personally based on understanding and just being exactly in the trenches for years on end, working towards a collaborative end goal.
Yeah. Tucson, where you all are, is like, that's one of the centers of where this happens. And that border relationship that, folks in Tucson, scientists in Tucson and scientists, their colleagues across the border in Mexico have, is just, something to be treasured and nurtured.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think to kind of maybe wrap us up here a little bit, and I guess, as a parting kind of question here, what would you say is the key message or messages you would like us to kind of take away with us this morning as we kind of continue to think through all these issues?
I'll start.
I think I'll go first.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think I want to leave a note on a positive note. I think the success we've had in the last 20 years of collaborative projects in the lower basin and the upper basin, the success we've had of being more accepting of the science, and the huge success that many of our major metropolitan areas like Las Vegas, Phoenix, Southern California, Denver have made in conservation leaves me believing that even if this river is cut down by climate change to something that we couldn't imagine 40, 50, 20 years ago, that we're going to survive, and we're going to survive quite well. I just think that necessity is the mother of invention, and there's a positive future in the Colorado River, even with far less water than we thought we had 20 years ago.
Yeah, I just have to agree with Eric. I actually am really optimistic. I think what we've seen in the last 10 or 20 years is both an increasing willingness to accept the reality of the science and increasing willingness to be collaborative rather than confrontational in how we respond to that science. And I just think we need to get on with this because it doesn't get any easier. It only gets harder, and it may get a lot harder over time. So, we're just getting started. We have a lot of work to do, but we've shown that we have the ability to do it. So I'm optimistic too.
I think that's the perfect place to end it on. So, John, Eric, thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your leadership in these topics and providing us with this great resource to go off of and to learn from. And thank you all for joining us this morning. Really appreciate, and Marie, and thank you for the U of A Press for creating this space for us to have this discussion that I know I was looking forward to it back in March, so I'm so glad we were able to do it today.
And I'll leave everybody with a view of Mount Sopris from my daughter's bedroom, which is the quiet room where I take these. So there's there's not as much snow on it as there should be.
Thanks all.
Take care. Thank you.